The fevered little girl's whisper cut through Emma's heart like a knife. Mama, don't leave me. But Emma wasn't her mama. She couldn't be anyone's mama. The doctor had made that crystal clear 3 years ago. Mrs. Henderson, your womb is barren. You'll never bear children. So why was this dying child clinging to her hand, calling her the one name she'd never thought she'd hear? And why did it feel so perfectly right? Emma pressed the cool cloth against 6-year-old Sarah Morrison's burning forehead, watching the child's pale lips move in restless sleep. The fever had raged for 3 days now, and despite all of Emma's careful nursing, the little girl seemed to be slipping away. Sarah's tiny fingers wrapped around Emma's wrist with surprising strength, as if she could sense that this gentle woman was her only anchor in a world of pain and confusion. Mama, Sarah whispered again, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment. Those blue eyes, so much like her father's, looked directly at Emma with complete trust and love. Mama, sing to me. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had been caring for this child for only 5 days, brought here by desperate circumstances and a father who had run out of options. She was supposed to be just a temporary caregiver, nothing more. But when Sarah called her Mama, something deep inside Emma's chest cracked open. A place she had sealed shut 3 years ago when Dr. Mitchell delivered his devastating verdict. Hush now, sweetheart, Emma murmured, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. She began humming a lullaby her own mother had sung to her long ago, watching as Sarah's breathing gradually became more even. The child's grip on her hand relaxed, but she didn't let go entirely, as if afraid Emma might disappear. Emma closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to truly be this little girl's mother. To wake up every morning knowing that someone needed her, loved her, depended on her completely. To have tiny arms wrap around her neck and hear, I love you, Mama, whispered against her cheek. To belong to someone, to matter in the deepest, most fundamental way. But that was impossible. The word barren echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She had accepted her fate, hadn't she? She had built a life around her limitations, found ways to survive without hope. So why did holding the child feel like coming home? As Sarah drifted back into sleep, Emma allowed her mind to wander back to that terrible day 3 years earlier when her world had shattered into a million pieces. She had been so hopeful then, so certain that she and James would fill their little cabin with children's laughter. They had been trying for 2 years with no success, and Emma had finally convinced James to visit Dr. Mitchell in town. She could still remember every detail of that gray December morning. The way James had held her hand in the waiting room, his palms sweaty with nervousness. The sound of Dr. Mitchell's boots on the wooden floor as he paced behind his desk, avoiding her eyes. The clinical coldness in his voice when he delivered the news that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson, he had said, not even looking at her as he shuffled through his papers. The examination confirms what I suspected. Your reproductive organs show significant abnormalities. Simply put, your womb is barren. You'll never bear children. Emma had felt the world tilt beneath her feet. James's hand had gone slack in hers. The doctor continued talking about medical terms she didn't understand, but all Emma could hear was that one terrible word, barren. Like a field that would never yield crops, a tree that would never bear fruit. Useless, broken, less than a woman. The months that followed had been a nightmare. James tried to be supportive at first, holding her when she cried, telling her they would be fine without children. But Emma saw how his eyes followed pregnant women on the street, how he grew quiet when they passed families at church. The disappointment festered between them like an infected wound. When James announced he was leaving for the California gold fields, they both knew it wasn't really about gold. It was about escape, from her, from their childless house, from the constant reminder of what she couldn't give him. He promised to send for her once he struck it rich, but his letters grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Emma had been alone ever since, surviving on seamstress work and the charity of neighbors who pitied the abandoned, barren wife. She had learned to avoid pregnant women, to cross the street when she saw children playing. She had built walls around her heart so high and thick that she thought nothing could ever break through them. But now, sitting in this ranch house with Sarah's small hand in hers, those walls were crumbling. Every soft breath the child took, every unconscious squeeze of her fingers, every whispered "mama" was breaking through Emma's defenses like water through a dam. How had she ended up here? How had a barren woman who couldn't even keep her own husband ended up caring for someone else's precious child? The answer lay with a desperate widowed rancher named Ezekiel Morrison, a man she had barely known existed until 6 days ago when he appeared at her cabin door with desperation in his eyes and a dying daughter in his arms. But that story, the story of how their broken lives had collided in this impossible moment, began 3 years earlier when Emma's world fell apart. It began with the crushing weight of that single word, barren, and the long, lonely years that followed. Little did Emma know that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest wounds, and that the child now calling her mama would teach her the most important truth of all. Motherhood isn't just about giving birth, it's about giving love. As Sarah stirred in her sleep and whispered, "Mama," one more time, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. 3 years earlier, Emma's world had shattered on a cold December morning in Dr. Mitchell's office. She could still remember the smell of carbolic acid that hung in the air, the way the leather examination table had creaked beneath her as she waited for news that would determine her entire future. James had paced nervously by the window, while Dr. Mitchell washed his hands with deliberate slowness, as if postponing the inevitable. "Well, doctor," James had finally asked, his voice tight with worry, "can you tell us why Emma hasn't conceived? We've been trying for over 2 years now." Dr. Mitchell dried his hands on a clean towel and turned to face them, his expression grave. Emma's heart began to pound as she saw the pity in his eyes, the same look she would come to know so well in the months that followed. He cleared his throat and opened her file, though she suspected he already knew what he was going to say. "I'm afraid the news isn't good," he began, his voice clinical and detached. "Mrs. Henderson, the examination reveals significant abnormalities in your reproductive system. Your womb is severely tilted, and there are signs of scarring that likely occurred during a childhood illness you may not even remember. Simply put, your body isn't capable of carrying a child to term." Emma felt the words hit her like physical blows. "But surely there's something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Mitchell shook his head firmly. "I've seen cases like yours before. Some women simply aren't meant for motherhood. It's God's will, and you'll need to accept it. My advice is to focus on being a good wife to your husband. There are many ways to find fulfillment in life besides bearing children." James had gone completely silent beside her. Emma looked at him desperately, searching for comfort, for hope, for anything that might soften the blow. But his face had turned pale, and she could see something dying in his eyes, the same dreams that were dying in her own heart. The ride home in their wagon had been torture. James kept his eyes on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Emma sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, feeling like she was already disappearing. When they finally spoke, their words were careful and polite, like strangers trying not to offend each other. "It's not your fault," James had said that night as they lay in bed, but his voice sounded hollow. "We'll make do somehow." But Emma knew that making do was not the same as being happy. She watched James over the following months, seeing how he looked away when their neighbor's baby cried, how he grew quiet at church when families filled entire pews. She saw him watching other men's children with a longing that made her chest ache. The whispers started almost immediately. In a small town like theirs, everyone knew everyone else's business, and Emma's childlessness became a topic of constant speculation. She would catch fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. "Poor James Henderson," she heard Mrs. Patterson say to Mrs. Bloom at the general store. "Married to a woman who can't give him children. What good is a wife who can't fulfill her most basic duty? My grandmother always said you can tell a woman's worth by how many babies she bears," Mrs. Bloom replied with a meaningful look in Emma's direction. "Some women just aren't built for motherhood, I suppose." Emma pretended not to hear, but each cruel comment felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She began avoiding public places, making excuses not to attend church gatherings or town socials. The isolation only made things worse between her and James. As winter turned to spring and spring to summer, James grew increasingly distant. He spent longer hours working their small farm, often not coming home until after dark. When he did speak to Emma, it was about practical matters, what needed fixing around the house, whether they had enough flour for the week. The easy intimacy they had once shared vanished completely. Emma threw herself into desperate attempts to change her fate. She visited every herb woman within 50 miles, swallowing bitter concoctions that were supposed to open the womb. She prayed until her knees were raw from kneeling on the hard chapel floor. She even made a pilgrimage to a shrine 3 towns over, where supposedly barren women had been miraculously healed. Nothing worked. Month after month, her body reminded her of her failure. She began to see her reflection differently, focusing on all the ways she had disappointed everyone, especially herself. Her own mother, dead now for 5 years, had given birth to 8 children. Emma couldn't even manage one. The final blow came on a September morning when James announced his decision over breakfast, not even looking up from his plate. "I've decided to join Tom Fletcher's group heading to California," he said, cutting his bacon with careful precision. "There's gold out there, Emma. Real gold. Enough to change our lives." Emma's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "California? But James, that's so far away. And so dangerous. A man needs to provide for his family," he replied, though they both knew there was no family to provide for. "I'll send for you once I'm established. Once we have enough money to make a fresh start somewhere new." Emma knew he was lying. She could see it in the way he avoided her eyes, in the relief that seemed to radiate from him at the thought of leaving. He wasn't going to California for gold. He was going to escape from her, from their barren marriage, from the constant reminder of what she couldn't give him. James left 2 weeks later with a wagon train of hopeful men seeking their fortunes. Emma stood in the doorway of their cabin and watched until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon. She was 25 years old, and already her life felt over. The letters came regularly at first, short notes about the journey, descriptions of the landscape, promises to write more when he had time to settle. But as the months passed, the letters became shorter and less frequent. The last one had come 8 months ago, a brief note saying he was working a claim and would write again soon. Emma knew she would never see her husband again. Now she lived alone in their tiny cabin, supporting herself by taking in sewing and mending. Every day was the same. Wake up, work until her fingers were sore, eat a simple meal, go to bed. She had learned to avoid mirrors, to cross the street when she saw pregnant women, to leave church early when families gathered their children for the walk home. She had accepted her fate. She was barren, abandoned, and alone. She would live out her days as the cautionary tale that mothers whispered to their daughters. See what happens when a woman can't fulfill her purpose? Even her own husband leaves her. Little did Emma know, 200 miles away, a widowed rancher was facing his own impossible situation. Ezekiel Morrison's wife had died, giving him the one gift Emma could never have, a daughter. But now that precious child was dying, and he was about to make a desperate decision that would change 3 lives forever. 200 miles away from Emma's lonely cabin, Ezekiel Morrison stood at his daughter's bedside, watching her small chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the ranch house, but it couldn't chase away the darkness that had settled over their home like a permanent shadow. Sarah had been sick again for 3 days now. Her fevered body, so small and fragile beneath the heavy quilts that she looked like she might disappear entirely. Ezekiel was a big man, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built from years of working cattle and taming wild horses. His hands could rope a steer or break a bronco, but they felt clumsy and useless when it came to caring for his 6-year-old daughter. Everything about him seemed too rough, too loud, too masculine for the gentle care that Sarah needed. He felt like a giant trying to handle delicate china, always afraid he might break something precious. It hadn't always been this way. When Margaret was alive, their home had been filled with warmth and laughter. Margaret Morrison had been everything Ezekiel wasn't. Gentle where he was rough, patient where he was quick-tempered, nurturing where he was practical. She had made their ranch house into a real home, complete with flowers in the windows, fresh bread always cooling on the kitchen table, and the soft sound of her humming while she worked. Margaret had wanted children desperately, and when Sarah was born in the spring of 1843, it seemed like their family was complete. Ezekiel could still remember holding his newborn daughter for the first time, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way she seemed to trust him completely. Margaret had laughed at his awkwardness, teaching him how to hold the baby properly, how to change her diaper, how to rock her sleep. "She's got your eyes," Margaret had whispered on that first day, tracing Sarah's tiny features with her finger. "But I hope she gets my gentle heart." For 6 years, they had been blissfully happy. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who followed her father around the ranch, chattering constantly about everything she saw. She would sit on the fence posts and watch him work with the horses, her blonde hair shining in the sun, her blue eyes wide with admiration. Ezekiel had never imagined he could love anything as much as he loved his little girl. But then Margaret got pregnant again, and everything changed. The pregnancy had been difficult from the start. Margaret was sick constantly, barely able to keep food down. Dr. Patterson from town visited regularly, but he seemed as worried as Ezekiel felt. When the labor finally began on that terrible October night in 1849, it lasted for nearly 2 days. Ezekiel could still hear Margaret's screams echoing through the house, still remember the helpless feeling of pacing the kitchen while Mrs. Calloway and Dr. Patterson worked frantically in the bedroom. The baby boy had lived for only 3 hours, and Margaret, weakened by the difficult birth and losing too much blood, had followed him into death just as the sun was rising. Ezekiel found himself a widower at 32, trying to raise a devastated 6-year-old daughter while dealing with his own crushing grief. Sarah had been inconsolable for weeks, crying for her mama and asking when she was coming back. Ezekiel had tried to explain death to a child who was too young to understand, his own heart breaking with every confused question she asked. Mrs. Calloway had stayed on to help with Sarah, but the elderly housekeeper was getting frail herself. She did her best to cook and clean, but she moved slowly and tired easily. More importantly, she wasn't the warm, nurturing presence that Sarah desperately needed. The child had become quiet and withdrawn, nothing like the bright, cheerful little girl she had been when her mother was alive. Over the past 2 years, Sarah had been sick more often than she was well. She caught every cold that went around, every fever that swept through the valley. Dr. Patterson said it wasn't unusual for children to get sick frequently, but Ezekiel couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was slowly fading away, as if she was trying to follow her mother into whatever world lay beyond this one. "This child needs more than medical care," Dr. Patterson had told Ezekiel during his last visit. "She needs warmth, comfort, a woman's gentle touch. Children who lose their mothers sometimes just give up fighting, unless you can find a way to give her what she's missing." The doctor didn't finish his sentence, but Ezekiel understood. Sarah needed a mother, or something as close to one as he could find. But where was a widowed rancher supposed to find such a woman? Most of the unmarried women in their small community were either too young or already spoken for. The few widows he knew had their own children to care for, their own problems to solve. It was Mrs. Calloway who finally suggested Emma Henderson. "There's a woman in Millerville who might help," the elderly housekeeper said one evening as they watched Sarah pick at her dinner, eating barely enough to keep a bird alive. Emma Henderson. Her husband ran off to California, left her all alone. She takes in sewing work, but I hear tell she's got the gentlest hands in 3 counties. My sister lives near there, says Emma helped nurse the Peterson baby through the croup last winter. Save that child's life, they say. Ezekiel had heard whispers about Emma Henderson, the abandoned wife who couldn't have children of her own. Most of the talk was unkind, the sort of cruel gossip that small towns seem to thrive on. But if she had helped save another child, if she truly had gentle hands and a caring heart, maybe she could help Sarah too. "You think she'd come?" Ezekiel asked, though part of him was already reluctant to bring a stranger into their grief-filled home. "Can't hurt to ask," Mrs. Calloway replied, watching Sarah push food around her plate without eating it. "Look at that child, Mr. Morrison. She's wasting away before our eyes. Something's got to change, or—" That night, Ezekiel sat beside Sarah's bed for hours, listening to her restless breathing and watching her pale face in the moonlight. She was so thin now, so fragile. Her blonde hair had lost its shine, and the bright curiosity that had once lit up her eyes seemed dimmed almost to nothing. She looked like a flower that wasn't getting enough sunlight, slowly wilting despite his desperate attempts to care for her. He thought about Margaret, about how naturally motherhood had come to her. She had known instinctively when Sarah was hungry or tired or needed comfort. She had sung lullabies that actually worked, told stories that chased away nightmares, kissed scraped knees in a way that made the pain disappear. Ezekiel could do none of those things. His voice was too deep for lullabies, his hands too calloused for gentle comfort. As Sarah stirred in her sleep and whispered "Mama" in a voice so soft it broke his heart, Ezekiel made his decision. He would swallow his pride and ride to Millerville to find Emma Henderson. He would ask a strange woman to come into his home and care for his daughter, because he was desperate enough to try anything. "I'll try anything to save my daughter," he whispered into the darkness, making a promise to Sarah and to Margaret's memory. Anything at all. 3 days later, as dawn broke over the mountains, Ezekiel saddled his horse and set out for Millerville. He had no idea that the woman he was about to meet was carrying wounds as deep as his own, or that sometimes God's greatest miracles happen when broken people find each other. He only knew that his little girl was dying, and Emma Henderson might be Sarah's only hope for survival. When Ezekiel Morrison knocked on Claire's cabin door that gray October morning, neither could imagine they were about to discover something miraculous. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest wounds. But would Emma dare risk her heart again? Emma was mending a torn shirt when the heavy knock came at her cabin door. She looked up from her sewing, startled by the sound. Visitors were rare in her isolated world, and unexpected ones even more so. Setting down her needle and thread, she smoothed her simple brown dress and opened the door to find a tall, broad-shouldered man standing on her porch, his hat in his hands and desperation written across his weathered face. "Mrs. Henderson?" His voice was deep and rough, like a man who spent more time talking to horses than to people. "I'm Ezekiel Morrison. I need your help." Emma recognized the name from town gossip. The widowed rancher whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years ago. She had seen him from a distance at church a few times, always sitting alone in the back pew, his daughter beside him looking pale and thin. Now up close, she could see the exhaustion in his blue eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with worry. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, not inviting him in. "What kind of help?" Ezekiel shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with having to ask for assistance. "It's my daughter, Sarah. She's very sick, ma'am." Has been for days now. Mrs. Calloway says you have gentle hands, that you helped the Peterson baby through the croup. I was wondering if you might come take a look at her. Emma's heart clenched at the mention of a sick child, but she forced herself to remain guarded. She had learned the hard way that getting attached to other people's children only led to heartbreak. I'm not a doctor, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps you should send for Dr. Patterson. I have, Ezekiel said quickly. He's done what he can, but Sarah isn't getting better. She's getting worse. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Emma saw him swallow hard. Mrs. Calloway thinks she thinks Sarah needs a woman's care. A mother's touch. The word mother hit Emma like a physical blow. She took a step back, shaking her head. I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I'm not. I'm not good with children. Ezekiel's face fell, but he didn't give up. Please, Mrs. Henderson. I know it's a lot to ask, and I know we're strangers, but I'm desperate. Sarah is all I have left in this world, and I'm watching her slip away. I don't know what else to do. Emma saw the naked pain in his eyes, the same helpless anguish she had felt when the doctor pronounced her barren. This man was facing the loss of his child, and she knew that particular kind of devastation all too well. But she also knew the danger of getting involved, of opening her heart to a child who wasn't hers. It would only be temporary, Ezekiel continued, sensing her hesitation. Just until she's well again. I can pay you for your time. I need someone who knows how to care for a sick child properly. Emma closed her eyes, fighting an internal battle between self-preservation and compassion. Every instinct told her to refuse, to protect herself from the inevitable attachment and heartbreak. But the image of a sick little girl, motherless and fading, tugged at something deep in her chest. Temporary, she said finally, the word barely above a whisper. Only until she's well. Yes, Ezekiel said quickly, relief flooding his features. Only temporary. I promise. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took 2 hours, and Emma spent every minute of it building walls around her heart. She would care for the child professionally, she told herself. She would use her nursing skills to help Sarah recover, then return to her cabin and her solitary life. She wouldn't allow herself to care too deeply, wouldn't let herself pretend this was anything more than a temporary job. But when Ezekiel led her into the ranch house and up the stairs to Sarah's bedroom, all of Emma's careful resolutions crumbled at the sight of the pale little girl lying so still beneath the quilts. Sarah Morrison was beautiful in the way that only truly innocent children can be. Her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spun gold, though it was dull now with fever. Her face was heart-shaped and delicate, with high cheekbones that would probably make her a stunning woman someday, if she lived to grow up. But it was her breathing that made Emma's heart ache, shallow and labored, as if each breath was a struggle. Sarah, sweetheart, Ezekiel said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. This is Mrs. Henderson. She's come to help you feel better. The child's eyes fluttered open, and Emma found herself looking into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. They were fever bright, but still held a spark of curiosity as they focused on Emma's face. Hello, Sarah, Emma said, her voice gentler than she had intended. She moved closer to the bed, and something extraordinary happened. Sarah smiled. It was a weak smile, barely there, but it transformed her entire face and sent a bolt of unexpected warmth through Emma's chest. Are you going to make me better? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I'm going to try, Emma replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Over the next few hours, Emma threw herself into caring for Sarah with a skill and tenderness that surprised even herself. She had helped with sick children before, but this felt different, more personal. More important, she prepared cool compresses for Sarah's fever, mixed herbal teas to help her breathing, and spoke to her in the soft, soothing voice that seemed to come naturally whenever she was near the child. Ezekiel watched from the doorway, marveling at the transformation in his daughter. Sarah responded to Emma's touch in a way she never responded to his own clumsy attempts at care. When Emma bathed her fevered face with cool water, Sarah leaned into the touch. When Emma hummed softly while adjusting her pillows, Sarah's breathing became more even. It was as if the child recognized something in Emma that she desperately needed. "She likes you," Ezekiel observed quietly, joining Emma beside the bed after Sarah had drifted off to sleep. "Children are good judges of character," Emma replied, though she couldn't take her eyes off Sarah's peaceful face. Against all her better judgment, she was already falling under this little girl's spell. Her mother used to sing to her every night, Ezekiel said, his voice heavy with memories. "Lullabies, mostly. Sarah hasn't wanted to hear singing since Margaret died. But when you were humming just now, she misses her mother," Emma said simply, understanding flooding through her. This child wasn't just sick in body. She was sick in spirit, grieving for the woman who had given her life and then left her far too soon. "We both do," Ezekiel admitted. "I'm not good at this, Mrs. Henderson. The gentle stuff, the caring. I try, but everything I do feels wrong." Emma looked at this strong man who was admitting his vulnerability so honestly, and she felt something shift in her chest. They were both broken people, she realized, both struggling with losses that had changed them fundamentally. The difference was that he still had something precious to fight for. "You love her," Emma said. "That's not nothing. That's everything." As the evening wore on, Emma found herself settling into a rhythm of care that felt both foreign and familiar. She prepared Sarah's medicine, adjusted her blankets, and sat beside her bed humming the lullabies her own mother had sung to her long ago. Each time Sarah stirred, Emma was there with a cool hand on her forehead or soft word of comfort. She told herself this was still temporary, still professional. But when Sarah's fever finally broke near midnight and the child opened her eyes with clarity for the first time in days, Emma felt a surge of maternal pride so fierce it took her breath away. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" Emma asked, smoothing Sarah's damp hair away from her face. Sarah looked up at her with those incredible blue eyes and said the words that would change everything. "Better, Mama. I feel better now." Emma's world stopped spinning. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared down at this child who had just called her the one thing she had never thought she would hear. She opened her mouth to correct Sarah, to remind her that she wasn't her mama, but the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, looking into Sarah's trusting face, Emma felt like a mother for the first time in her life. And despite all her fears, despite all her careful walls, it felt perfectly, wonderfully right. For 5 days, Emma poured her bottled-up motherly love into caring for Sarah. She told herself it was temporary, professional. But on the 6th morning, when Sarah's fever finally broke and the child opened her eyes, Emma heard the word that would shatter every wall she'd built around her heart. "Better, Mama. I feel better now." The words hung in the air like a prayer answered and a heart broken all at once. Emma stared down at Sarah's flushed but clear face, her own heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the house could hear it. The child's fever had finally broken after 6 days of careful nursing, and in that moment of relief and clarity, Sarah had spoken the word that Emma had given up hope of ever hearing. "Mama." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to correct the child, to gently remind her that she wasn't her mama, that her real mama was in heaven with the angels. But when she looked into those trusting blue eyes, the correction died on her lips. Because for the first time in 3 years, Emma felt whole. She felt like she belonged somewhere, to someone. "I'm so glad you're feeling better, sweetheart," Emma whispered instead, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name. She smoothed Sarah's blonde hair away from her face, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, how right it seemed to be caring for this precious child. From the doorway, Ezekiel watched the tender scene with something close to amazement. He had seen his daughter interact with many adults over the past 2 years, doctors, neighbors, Mrs. Calloway, but never had he witnessed such an immediate and deep connection. Sarah responded to Emma's touch like a flower turning toward the sun, and Emma seemed to bloom under the child's affection in return. Over the following days, as Sarah grew stronger, the bond between her and Emma deepened in ways that both thrilled and terrified Emma. The child followed her everywhere, chattering constantly about anything and everything that crossed her mind. She wanted Emma to braid her hair, to tell her stories, to sing the lullabies that helped chase away the nightmares that had plagued her since her mother's death. "Mama Emma," Sarah would say, tugging on Emma's skirt, "will you teach me how to make biscuits like you did yesterday? Mama Emma, look at the butterfly I found. Mama Emma, will you read me a story before bed?" Each time Sarah called her Mama, Emma felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost painful. She had never imagined that being needed could feel so wonderful, that having someone depend on her completely could fill the empty spaces in her heart so perfectly. But with the joy came fear, deep, bone-deep terror that this couldn't last, that she was setting herself up for the worst heartbreak of her life. Emma tried to convince herself that Sarah's attachment was temporary, born of gratitude and the child's desperate need for maternal comfort. Once Sarah was fully recovered, once she realized that Emma wasn't really her mother, surely the spell would break. But as the days passed and Sarah's health returned, the child's devotion only seemed to grow stronger. Sarah insisted on helping with every task, no matter how simple. She would stand on a wooden crate beside Emma at the kitchen counter, carefully measuring flour while Emma mixed dough for bread. She would sit beside Emma in the evening, watching intently as Emma mended clothes or worked on her embroidery. Most precious of all, she would curl up in Emma's lap before bedtime, listening to stories with rapt attention. "Tell me about the princess again," Sarah would say, her small head resting against Emma's shoulder. "The one who lived in the tower." Emma would weave tales of brave princesses and noble knights, of magic kingdoms and happy endings, all while breathing in the sweet scent of Sarah's hair and marveling at the trust this child placed in her. Sometimes she would catch Ezekiel watching from the hallway, a look of gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like hope, in his eyes. But happiness, Emma had learned, was a fragile thing. And in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, her growing attachment to Sarah didn't go unnoticed. It started with sideways glances at church. Emma had begun attending services again, sitting with Ezekiel and Sarah in what had once been a Morrison family pew. She told herself it was for Sarah's sake. The child needed the stability of routine, the comfort of familiar traditions. But the truth was, Emma loved being part of family again, even if it was temporary. The whispers began almost immediately. "Look at her." Emma heard Mrs. Patterson hiss to Mrs. Bloom after Sunday service. "Acting like that child belongs to her. Doesn't she know her place?" "It's shameful," Mrs. Bloom replied, loud enough for Emma to hear. The barren woman playing mother to someone else's child. She's forgotten what she is. Emma felt her cheeks burn with shame, but Sarah's small hand slipping into hers gave her strength. She lifted her chin and walked past the gossiping women with as much dignity as she could muster. But the cruel comments followed her everywhere. At the general store, she overheard Mrs. Wilson telling the shopkeeper, "That Henderson woman is getting above herself. Ezekiel Morrison should be careful. Women like her get too attached. She'll be expecting him to marry her next. Mark my words." The worst came from Mrs. Patterson herself, spoken directly to Emma outside the church one Sunday. "Mrs. Henderson," the older woman said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I hope you're not getting too comfortable in your current arrangement. It wouldn't be proper for a woman in your condition to overstep her bounds." "My condition?" Emma asked, though she knew exactly what Mrs. Patterson meant. "A barren woman playing at motherhood," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "It's not natural and it's not right. That child needs a real mother, not someone who's forgotten her place in God's plan." Emma felt the words hit her like physical blows. All her old shame came flooding back. The doctor's diagnosis, James's abandonment, her own sense of being fundamentally broken. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe she was overstepping her bounds, forgetting what she was and what she could never truly be. That evening, as she helped Sarah get ready for bed, Emma found herself pulling back emotionally. When Sarah asked for a bedtime story, Emma suggested she might want to hear one from her father instead. When the child wanted to practice braiding hair, Emma claimed she had too much mending to finish. Sarah noticed the change immediately, her bright eyes growing confused and hurt. "Did I do something wrong, Mama Emma?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Emma's heart broke at the question. "No, sweetheart, you've done nothing wrong. Then why won't you play with me anymore? Why won't you sing to me?" Emma knelt down to Sarah's level, fighting back tears. I think maybe it's time for me to go back to my own cabin. You're feeling much better now, and your father and Mrs. Calloway can take care of you." Sarah's face crumpled. "But I don't want you to leave. You're my mama now." "No," Emma said gently, though the word felt like poison on her tongue. "I'm not your mama, Sarah. Your mama is in heaven. I was just helping until you got well. But you are my mama," Sarah insisted, tears streaming down her face. "You take care of me and sing to me and love me. That's what mamas do." Emma stood abruptly, unable to bear the child's tears. "I have to go pack my things." She left Sarah crying in her bedroom and went to gather her few belongings, her hands shaking as she folded her dresses into her traveling bag. This was for the best, she told herself. She was protecting both of them from greater heartbreak down the road. She was remembering her place, accepting her limitations. But as she packed, she could hear Sarah's sobs echoing through the house, and each cry felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Ezekiel appeared in her doorway as she was closing her bag. "You don't have to leave," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," Emma replied without looking at him. "This was always temporary. Sarah is well now. She doesn't need me anymore." "That's not true, and you know it." Emma finally met his eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude or friendship, but something deeper. Something that terrified her even more than Sarah's attachment. "I can't stay," she whispered. "I can't be what she needs. I can't be what either of you needs." The next morning, Emma loaded her few possessions into the wagon that would take her back to Millerville. Sarah stood at the bedroom window, her face pressed against the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks. Emma forced herself not to look up as the wagon rolled away from the Morrison Ranch, but she couldn't block out the sound of Sarah's desperate cries. "Mama Clara, come back. Please come back." As the ranch house disappeared behind them, Emma told herself she had done the right thing. She had protected her heart and Sarah's future. But deep down, she knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Clara packed her few belongings with trembling hands. She had to leave before the attachment grew stronger, before the inevitable heartbreak. But as her wagon rolled away from the ranch, she couldn't hear Sarah's desperate cries from the bedroom window. "Mama Clara, come back. Please come back." And she couldn't see Ezekiel's face as he realized he was about to lose the woman who had brought his daughter back to life. Emma had been back in her lonely cabin for 3 days when the frantic pounding on her door shattered the midnight silence. She bolted upright in bed, her heart racing as she threw on her robe and hurried to the door. Through the window, she could see a horse lathered with sweat and a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. "Mrs. Henderson." Ezekiel's voice was raw with desperation. "Please, I need you to come quickly. Sarah is dying." Emma's blood turned to ice. She flung open the door to find Ezekiel Morrison standing on her porch, his hat gone, his hair wild from riding hard through the night. His clothes were rumpled, his face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. "What happened?" Emma asked, already moving to gather her things. "The fever came back worse than before," Ezekiel said, his voice breaking. "She's been calling for you constantly, crying until she made herself sick. Mrs. Calloway says she won't eat, won't drink." She just keeps asking when Mama Emma is coming home. He swallowed hard, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. Dr. Patterson says if the fever doesn't break by morning, he didn't need to finish. Emma was already pulling on her boots, her hands shaking as she grabbed her medical supplies and the few herbs she kept for treating fevers. The 3-day separation from Sarah had been torture, but she had told herself it was necessary. That time would heal both their wounds. Now she realized her leaving had only made everything worse. "How long has she been like this?" Emma asked as they rode through the darkness, her arms wrapped tightly around Ezekiel's waist as his horse thundered across the moonlit landscape. "Since the morning after you left," Ezekiel replied grimly. She cried for hours, then went quiet. Too quiet. By evening, she was burning up with fever again. It's like she just gave up fighting. Emma's heart shattered at his words. She had seen this before in children who had lost too much, who had endured more grief than their young hearts could bear. Sometimes they simply decided that the world was too painful a place to stay in. When they reached the ranch house, Emma could hear Sarah's delirious crying before they even dismounted. She raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and burst into Sarah's bedroom to find the child thrashing weakly in her bed, her face flushed scarlet with fever, her blonde hair dark with sweat. "Mama Emma," Sarah whispered, her eyes unfocused and glassy. "Where's Mama Emma? I want my mama." "I'm here, sweetheart," Emma said, rushing to the bedside and immediately placing her cool hands on Sarah's burning forehead. "Mama's here now." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on Emma's face. When recognition dawned, a weak smile crossed her lips. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I came back," Emma replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll always come back to you." For the next 18 hours, Emma fought for Sarah's life with every skill she possessed. She bathed the child's fevered body with cool water, forced spoonfuls of herbal tea between her cracked lips, and held her during the violent shaking fits that seized her small frame. Most importantly, she never left Sarah's side, constantly reassuring the child with her presence and her voice. Ezekiel hovered nearby, watching in amazement as Emma worked tirelessly to save his daughter. He could see the deep love in every gentle touch, hear it in every soothing word. This wasn't the professional care of a hired nurse. This was a mother fighting desperately to save her child. "You love her," he said quietly during one of Sarah's peaceful moments. Emma looked up from where she was adjusting Sarah's blankets, tears streaming down her face. "More than my own life," she admitted. "I try to convince myself it was just professional attachment, but she's my heart, Ezekiel. I don't know how it happened so fast, but she's become everything to me." "Then why did you leave?" Emma's shoulders sagged with exhaustion and grief. "Because everyone was right. I'm barren, broken. What right do I have to play mother to your precious daughter? What right do I have to love her when I can't give her what a real mother could?" Ezekiel knelt beside Emma's chair, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Emma, look at me." When she met his eyes, he continued, "You've given Sarah more love and care in these past weeks than she's had since her mother died. You brought her back from the edge of death twice now. If that's not real motherhood, I don't know what is." As dawn broke on the second day, Sarah's fever finally began to break. Her breathing became less labored, her skin cooled, and when she opened her eyes, they were clear and focused for the first time in days. "Mama," she said softly, looking directly at Emma. "You didn't leave me." Emma's tears fell freely now. "No, sweetheart, I'll never leave you again. Not ever." Sarah reached up with a weak hand to touch Emma's face. "Promise." "I promise," Emma whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Over the next few days, as Sarah slowly recovered her strength, something fundamental shifted between the three of them. Emma no longer tried to maintain professional distance or remind Sarah that she wasn't her real mother. Instead, she embraced the role fully, reveling in Sarah's constant chatter, teaching her to cook and sew, reading her stories every night before bed. Ezekiel watched it all with growing wonder and a feeling he was almost afraid to name. Emma had brought light back into their dark house, laughter back into their daily routine. But more than that, she had shown him what it meant to love without reservation, to give of yourself completely for another person's happiness. One evening, after Sarah had fallen asleep between them while Emma read from a book of fairy tales, Ezekiel finally found the courage to speak. "Emma," he said quietly, "I have something to ask you." Emma looked up from where she was gently stroking Sarah's hair. "What is it?" Ezekiel took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. "I know this might seem sudden, and I know we haven't courted properly, but I've been watching you with Sarah, and I've seen how much you both need each other. I've also seen how much I need you both." Emma's heart began to race as she realized what he was about to say. "Emma Henderson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not just because Sarah needs a mother, though God knows she does, but because I've fallen in love with the woman who saved my daughter's life and brought joy back into our home." Emma stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Ezekiel, I can't give you more children. The doctor said—" "I don't care what any doctor said," Ezekiel interrupted firmly. "I've got the family I need right here in this room. You and Sarah are enough for me. More than enough." Sarah stirred between them, opening her sleepy eyes. "Are you going to marry Mama Emma?" "Papa," she asked with the innocent directness of childhood. Ezekiel smiled. "That depends on whether Mama Emma will have us." Sarah sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Oh, please say yes, Mama Emma. Then you could be my real mama forever and ever." Emma looked at these two people who had become her whole world, and she felt the last of her walls crumble. "You are my real family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Biology doesn't make a family. Love does. Is that a yes?" Ezekiel asked, hope shining in his eyes. "Yes." Emma whispered, then louder, "Yes, yes, yes." Sarah squealed with delight, throwing her arms around both of them. "I'm going to have a mama and a papa, and we're going to be a real family." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the little church in town. Sarah served as flower girl, her face radiant with happiness as she watched her beloved Mama Emma become her official mother. Even some of the townspeople who had gossiped cruelly before seemed moved by the obvious love between the three of them. As Emma stood at the altar, promising to love and honor Ezekiel Morrison for the rest of her life, she marveled at how God worked in mysterious ways. She had thought her story ended with barrenness and abandonment, but instead, it had been the beginning of a different kind of miracle. 6 months after their wedding, Emma woke one morning feeling queasy and tired in a way that was hauntingly familiar. At first, she dismissed it as stress or perhaps something she had eaten. But when the symptoms persisted for a week, she began to hope for something she had given up on long ago. Dr. Patterson confirmed what Emma barely dared to believe. She was pregnant. "But how is this possible?" Emma asked, her hands instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. The other doctor said I was barren." Dr. Patterson shook his head with a smile. "Sometimes love can heal what medicine cannot explain, Mrs. Morrison. I've seen it happen before. Women who couldn't conceive for years suddenly find themselves expecting after finding true happiness and peace." When Emma told Ezekiel the news, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around the kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. Sarah, now 8 years old and glowing with health, clapped her hands with delight when they told her she was going to be a big sister. "I always wanted a baby brother or sister," Sarah exclaimed. "And now the baby will have the best mama in the whole world, just like me." 2 years later, as Emma watched Sarah teach her baby brother Thomas to walk in the garden behind their house, she finally understood the truth that had taken her so long to learn. The doctor had been wrong. She wasn't barren. She had been waiting for a little girl who needed a mama and a man who needed a wife, and a love so powerful it could heal the deepest wounds and create miracles that defied medical explanation. Standing in the doorway with her hand resting on her growing belly, she was expecting again. Emma smiled as she watched her children play. Sarah had her blonde hair in braids now, and she was patiently helping little Thomas take his first wobbly steps across the grass. The sight filled Emma's heart to overflowing. "Come on, Tommy," Sarah encouraged, clapping her hands. "You can do it. Walk to your big sister." Thomas took 2 shaky steps before tumbling into Sarah's waiting arms, and both children dissolved into giggles. Emma's eyes filled with tears of pure joy as she watched them together. Her daughter and her son, bound not by blood alone, but by the love that had brought them all together. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't grow in wounds, Emma whispered to herself, echoing the wisdom she had learned through years of heartbreak and healing. They grow in hearts brave enough to love again. As Ezekiel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, Emma leaned back against his solid warmth and watched their children play in the golden afternoon sunshine. She had been called infertile for years, told she would never be a mother. But love had proven stronger than any medical diagnosis, and now she had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. The greatest miracle of all wasn't that she had finally conceived. It was that she had learned the true meaning of motherhood. It wasn't about carrying a child in your womb. It was about carrying them in your heart. And Emma's heart was full to overflowing with the family that love had given her.